Давайте. Сейчас видно, да, наверное, так работает, да. I will read my paper in English because I was used to think about this conference as an English-speaking conference, so I need some time to switch from Russian to English. So I put both titles for my paper in the first slide. And in March 2005, the Bolshoi Theatre staged the opera Deти, Rosenthal, The Children of Rosenthal, by Leonid Desyatnikov, under the direction of Alexander Vediernikov and Tasnaprocius. Back in June 2002, the artistic director of the theatre, Anatoly Iksanov, had commissioned the libretto from Vladimir Sorokin. The writer's contract with the theatre and the production itself caused a public outcry associated with the scandalous fame of the author. However, the title was not removed from the theatre repertoire, and in 2006, it also brought the theatre a special jury prize at the Zolotaya Maska competition. This is the fish and the author. The plot of the opera is to some extent connected with the plot of the novel Blue Lard by the same writer, which was published in 1999 by the Moscow publishing house Admarkin. The novel revolves around a substance with a unique structure with zero entropy called Blue Lard. This mysterious potion is produced by clones of Russian prominent writers, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Akhmatova, Platonov, Nabokov, Pasternak, Tolstoy, and Simon. The plot of the opera has something in common with the novel, though not being its pure intersemiotic translation. Its protagonist is Alex Rosenthal, a fictitious Greek scientist who was born in 1910 in Berlin, where he invented a method of duplication of any living being by asexual reproduction. Having tested it on human beings, he became the first donor for his experiments, and after emigrating to the Soviet Union in the 1930s, he began to duplicate immortal composers of the past: Mozart, Wagner, Mussorgsky, Tchaikovsky, and Verdi. The lives of their duplicates run parallel to their reigns, to the governments of various Soviet leaders, from Stalin to the collapse of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, in 1992, the scientist dies, and after his death, the doubles find themselves without a place of residence, far beyond being underestimated and misunderstood, and feel their uselessness and restlessness in the modern world. At the beginning of the second act, we find them at the Komsomolskaya Square in Moscow, lost in a crowd of harmless departing people and their companions, taxi drivers, merchants, refugees, homeless people, and prostitutes. In this context, only Tanya, a prostitute whose name significantly recalls the famous literary heroine Tatiana from Giuliani, is able to understand the talent and the artistic value of Mozart. She starts an affair with him, but her pimp, Kela, tries his best to separate them, and in the end poisons her and the doubles. Despite the legend that surrounds Mozart's death, his double alone turns out to survive poisoning and outlive his father and brothers, but he cannot return to music in any way. When Sorokin's Голубое Salo was first published, the literary critic Mark Lipavietsky noted the author's multilingualism. The characters' speeches include Old Church Slavonicism, phrases in Yiddish, French, and German, a special jargon replete with Chinese words and Russian curse words. The writer also calls upon Soviet mass culture and the literary language of the duplicated Russian and Soviet classics. The imitation of their style included in the novel, which at first sight could resemble a parody, reflects the postmodernist character of Sorokin's writing, where a closer look reveals the playful practice of replacing the originals with what Dirk Offerman, defined as the imperfect reproduction of various poetics from the past. This remark applies also to the libretto of Deти Rozenthalia. Relying on the artistic image of the clone, Sorokin conveys an inaccurate reconstruction of the image of the music geniuses of the past, under the sign of a surrogate, including in the text indirect references to the composer's life and works. In addition to the libretto, a similar technique can be observed in Desyatnikov's music. The presence of clones of great musicians in the plot has a corresponding element in the imperfect reproduction of their musical language. Each of the duplicates is associated to one or more motifs in the creative manner of their originals, which take the form of quotation from famous works or just replication of stylistic patterns. In addition, stimulated by these playful practices of the libretto, Desyatnikov includes a number of allusions to the style and specific works of other classics of music, such as Dmitri Shostakovich, despite the fact that there is no character duplicating him in the plot. Sorokin defined this system with the term «mishtitatni mastiki», that is, the immersion of the stylistic devices of classical composers in a neutral texture. In so doing, Desyatnikov builds the structure of the plot in such a way that the musical embodiment of historical musicians has the same cloned nature of the characters. Such a structure reflects the postmodernistic feature of double coding, a technique that allows for the coexistence of two or more codes in the same work, which in turn provides the opportunity of a double level of reading. A direct reading, more naive or immediate if you want, obtained through initial listening of the opus per se. And a more mediated reading, which rather than conscious, I would define as multidimensional, since in front of a music scene performance, the listener not only recognizes references, but also enjoys the whole accumulation of previous traditions in a single contextual moment. Elements of historical origin are highly recognizable to the musically educated listener who has the necessary knowledge of the classical repertoire to trace the references immersed in the connective tissue. In this perspective, the practices of literary postmodernism are applied to music theatre, offering the composer the opportunity to assimilate the material of the classical canon and to merge it in the flagrancy of the action presented on the stage, increasing the dimensions of this game of references. In the selection of historical figures to be cloned by Rosenthal in the poetic fiction and behind him by the authors, one can detect a cultivated level of reading. The choice of exactly 5 composers possibly refers to the mighty handful. That is the 5. That is the group of the same number of musicians who are credited with the founding of the national music canon, the Russian style. Moreover, each double represents a distinct tradition that played an essential role in the development of a global history of opera. As a result, a dialogue between different operatic traditions is thus organized. Italian opera confronts Wagner's German music drama and Mozart's Viennese classicism. As for the Russian context, Mussorgsky and Tchaikovsky act as the icons of 2 concepts of Russian music, far one from each other, while both developed on a national basis. An exclusive approach aimed at achieving originality along the path of reviving folk music and its application to national subjects, it's the case of Mussorgsky and the 5, and a more inclusive one, which allows the compatibility of Russian folk music with expressive techniques of Western origins. This is the case of Tchaikovsky. Desyatnikov confirms this hypothesis, stating that the composers were selected on the basis of a mutual complementarity, all of them being connected with their interest in writing for the stage. Rosenthal's children, however, are not only young, but infantile indeed. Their isolation compounding their infantilism, rendering them unprepared for confrontation with reality as it is evident in the scene at the Komsomolskaya Square. Nevertheless, these characters are responsible for their emblematic meaning, serving as symbols of the context of their provenance. In an interview released before the premiere, the composer emphasized that композители все дальше и дальше от нас уходят, хотя музыка по-прежнему существует, активно исполняется и, собственно говоря, является эмблематичной. Starting from these observations, we shall now focus on the musical image of one of them, the double of the Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi, in order to investigate the way his image resonates with the general reception of Italian opera in Russia. My analysis will be based on the opera libretto, which is available on the writer's website, and the piano score, which was kindly provided by the St. Petersburg publishing house Composita. The analysis of the verbal, you also saw the cover of the disc, which was released several years ago, and which I also used to confront with the score. And the analysis of the verbal text of the libretto led me to the conclusion that the image of the Italian composer is based on several opera clichés. As well as in the case with Wagner, who sings in German in the opera, Verdi's double is characterized by insertions in Italian, such as Studi, fratello mio, and others. The only theme of his lines is love, which only at the end of the opera is combined with the theme of death. L'amore è libero e impetuoso, l'amore è santo e meraviglioso, aleggia dove vuole, in chiunque può albergare, comparir può all'improvviso e all'improvviso dileguare. We shall listen to this sort of aria later in the following part of my presentation. The verbal text is full of absurd, monotone poetic lines of the lowest quality. Let's take as the best example the expression bello bambino, which in Italian sounds terrible, and which reminds me actually about the discourse that Julia just said about the reception of Italian song. We will probably have the opportunity to discuss this later, because I didn't include this in my paper, but I have the impression that much of the image of Italy through opera is actually deformed by the presence of Italian song in the Soviet period, in the Soviet Union, of course. But coming back to the libretto, the verbal text is also interspersed with cliché coming from a superficial view of characters and singers. Verdi's double wishes Mozart to be cheerful. This word is very common in critical articles referring to singers, to opera singers in the 19th century, Visioli. And when dying, Verdi's double utters quite inadequate words like "ho paura, cranio." According to the mentioned practice of surrogate and unprecise reproduction, his lines include caricaturated echoes of foreign philosophical positions, Russian but not only. I took the case of l'amore salverà il mondo, which seems a reference to the famous passage from Dostoevsky's novel The Idiot, which by means of the translation into Italian is declined towards the stereotypical national trait of Italian musical culture. Love, first of all, and in this case, love replacing beauty. As I said, the music reflects such an image and a practice. The opera consists of 5 parts, картины, each of one, according to the composer, это как бы опера, написанная одним из персонажей Библии, хотя они об этом не подозревают. Это заложено, кстати сказать, и в либретто, где есть, может быть, цитаты или искаженные цитаты. Интересно, может быть, но вплоть до неждометия. Я должен еще сказать, что поскольку композиторы Дубли в какой-то момент осиротели, были вынуждены себе зарабатывать за хлеб, то они выходят на площади и улицы Москвы или подземные переходы и там играют и поют, как уличные музыканты, и у каждого из них есть свой инструмент. Because of this, each scene stylizes some abstract opera by Verdi or Wagner or Mussorgsky and so on, in order to convey the representation of each historical composer. However, the need for stage representation, combined with the postmodernist practices of double coding and imperfect reproduction, lead to another phenomenon in the score of Detti Rosenthal. On the stage, every genius of the past not only recalls his own works, but turns into one of his characters, the authors making them identifying with their own protagonists. The composer explained this recurring to another literary reference. Emma Italia, как сказал Флабер, или Анна Каренина Италья, или поэтому, подобно этому Вагнер мог бы сказать Брунильда Италья. Desyatnikov obtained this by exploiting different means. The first is the selection of vocal registers and their distribution among the actors. Each composer is endowed with his own voice, and the choice was determined according to the principle of coincidence of the historical composer with his typical characters. The double of Giuseppe Verdi is musically embodied in the register of baritone. The association is given not only with one single character, in his case, but with a number of typical characters from his works, and this is made possible by the stereotyped nature of the plots of the Italian opera of the bel canto era. In Verdi's production, several baritone roles stand out, embodiments of unforgettable roles. Conte di Luna, di opera Il Trovatore, Rigoletto, di Polymos Carter, Papa Germone in La Traviata, Amonasro in Aida. In addition, the baritone is often the antagonist of the main lover's couple in Verdi's works, and in The Children of Rosenthal, the pimp Chiela, who also sings with the register of a baritone, could be seen as a surrogate for Iago in Verdi's Otello. Furthermore, Verdi's duplication is realized by allusion to style, to passages reminding him his masterpieces, and with combination with iconic instruments. Verdi's double plays the harp, an association that really cannot be considered predictable. Where does this come from? As the composer himself admitted, сочетание инструментов довольно дикое, но имелось в виду, что это инструмент характерный для того или иного композитора. Desyatnikov explains his choice. Если вы помните «Трубадур», то Манрико, главный герой «Трубадура», играет на чем-то похожем, на лютне, но в оркестре у Верди звучит арфа. The composer has in mind the second scene of the first act of Verdi's Trovatore, in which Manrico's voice is heard for the first time from behind the curtain. Let's try to listen to it. Is that of a surrogate for the lute. In turn, Desyatnikov uses the same instrument to allude to the character and thus indirectly to its creator. characters is complemented by an allusion to his masterpiece La Traviata, the third element of the famous popular trilogy, along with Rigoletto and Il Trovatore. The image of Tanya in Desятников's opera echoes the theme of a fallen woman, the theme that is at the foundation of the Venetian opera based on the novel The Lady of the Camellias by Alessandro Dumas. No wonder if, precisely because of the characterization of Tatiana's image as a prostitute, and because of the marginal milieu in which she lives, at the time of the premiere, the children of Rosenthal caused a scandal, just like Verdi's trilogy was once accused of vulgarity. In the discussion of Detti Rosenthal, the music, though, was not subject to charges. On the contrary, this is really postmodern. Okay. From a review, Desyatnikov, it was written, показать себя здесь мастером стилизации, искусственности высшего пилотажа, что у неискушенного слушателя вполне может вызвать мысль об откровенном подражательстве. To some extent, this confirms the efficacy of the composer at recreating the musical language. A discussion of this point of view will serve as the conclusion of my paper. I will argue that rather than imitate Verdi's stylistic patterns, Desyatnikov seems to hint at the works and artistic techniques characteristic of Italian Romantic repertoire indirectly. The harp is not a typical instrument for Verdi. Rather, it is associated in more general terms with Italian bel canto composers, such as Donizetti. The very fact that Verdi uses it to replace the lute to accompany Manrico's aria is a common technique in the 19th century, since filling a theatre hall required a sound mass that a lute alone could not create. Similarly, Glinka uses the association of harp and piano to imitate the sound of the gusli in his Ruslan. On the contrary, the characters' parts lack their characteristic rudeness, which is bound with the scenic impact of Verdi's parola scene. They're very rude, and Desятников's characters are not, actually. Finally, in Sorokin's libretto, one would hardly find a dramaturgical plan that gave Verdi, as a composer, the possibility to recur to the solita forma. This opera is actually created in the sort of dramaturgical structure of several different pictures, frescoes, put one after the other. The analysis